Welcome, everyone. We're here for the Authors Guild Foundation webinar, Negotiating Literary Translation Contracts. We have three experts to speak to the matter here. Umair Kazi, the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Authors Guild. He studied law at the University of Iowa and creative writing at Columbia University. Julia Sanchez has translated more than a dozen books from Spanish, Portuguese, and Catalan into English. Her translations and writing have appeared in Granta, LitHub, the Paris Review Daily, The Common, among others. She's received support for her work from the Penn Heim Grant, Penn Translates, and the New York State Council on the Arts. She was born in Brazil and now lives in Providence, Rhode Island. And Alex Zucker's translations from Czech include many novels, as well as stories, plays, subtitles, young adult and children's books, song lyrics, essays, poems, much more. And he's been instrumental in developing the Authors Guild Literary Translation Model Contract. So we're looking forward to today's chat. Everyone in the audience, you can use the Q&A box below to submit any questions you might have along the way. And we'll have a little time for Q&A toward the end. There are closed captions and a live transcript available for accessibility. You can find those at the bottom of the screen. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Umair. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Johnny. And thanks again for this. If you are a translator, and especially if you're a translator with the Authors Guild, you've probably dealt with me at some point. It's just such a pleasure to be on this webinar with Alex and Julia. I've personally, we put out, I think it's been a year since we released our translator book contract, and it's publicly available to anyone. You don't have to be an Authors Guild member. Same with the Model Trade Book Agreement, incidentally. But the preparation of that contract for me was just such a highlight of my time at the Guild. There were a lot of interesting legal questions that came in. I learned so much of the actual contract, and the commentary was basically guided by Alex and Julia and Jessica Cohen, who's not present there, on this webinar, just their experiences as a translator. So I'm actually going to turn it now to Alex to just talk about, because he was involved in from the first day of the genesis of the Authors Guild translation book contract. So I'll let Alex speak to the prehistory.
The prehistory. Thank you, Umair.
Before the flood.
My name is Alex Zucker, pronouns he, him, his, and I'm really grateful and excited to be here for the Authors Guild's first ever webinar on negotiating literary translation contracts. It's a great day. And so I'll just say a few words. I know people have a lot of questions. We got a lot of great questions submitted. And so I don't want to spend too long on this, but just to give people a sense of where this contract came from, I would bring it back to the time 2014 to 2016, when I was serving as co-chair of the PEN America Translation Committee, first with Margaret Carson, and then with Allison Markin Powell. And the PEN America Translation Committee has had a model contract for literary translation since the early 80s. But the issue was that because contracts and those types of rights are not part of PEN America's mission, PEN America deals with free expression. There was nobody on staff at PEN America who was authorized to give translators, or authors for that matter, advice on contracts. So the translation committee had this model contract. Occasionally the committee, this is prior to my joining it, occasionally the committee would round up money and hire an agent or a lawyer to advise on the issues, to keep its contract updated, but the committee wasn't in a position to actually give translators legal advice. So at a certain point, thanks to Susan Bernofsky, who was chair of the translation committee before I was one of the co-chairs, I found out that the Authors Guild actually advised people on contracts and was open to translators. So I joined the Guild and approached Mary Rasenberger, who was then the new um, executive director of the Guild back in 2014 about the possibility of a translators section within the Guild, a model contract, and eventually that discussion turned into also the idea of doing a survey of working conditions for literary translators in the US. So we had some actual data about what kind of contract terms translators were getting instead of just the anecdotal information that was being passed around among us. So there was a group of us at the translation committee, and I'm going to put here in the chat an interview I did with Hopscotch, a magazine on translation, where I go into this in detail and name all the people who were involved. Again, I want to keep this brief, but it was a whole group of us who drew up a first model contract to bring to the Guild based on the Pen America translation model contract, but going beyond it. And then over the course of the next, I guess it was 6 years, a smaller group of us, mainly besides myself, Julia, who's here with us today, and Jessica Cohen, who is not, we just kept grinding and grinding away at it because we really wanted an extensive commentary to go with the contract as well. And, you know, issues kept coming up. So it took a long time to bring to fruition. But, and along the way, we did that survey of translator working conditions, which came out in 2017. We're now preparing a new survey to do this year in 2022 to see how conditions have changed, if at all. And I think that about covers it.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for that. So I'll just quickly give everyone an overview of what the Authors Guild translator book contract covers. I mean, it's rather the question is what it doesn't cover. I think that's a good place to start. So it's most useful. Its utility is greatest for translators of a prose work, so nonfiction or fiction, and book length projects. So it can be used by poets, translators of poetry, especially if they're working on a book project. But it's not the provisions wouldn't be as applicable for, you know, for literary magazine publications. There's just a very different sort of environment. But nonetheless, like if you were a translator, I would highly recommend looking through the contract, and because it does go into the weeds in terms of substantive issues that translators face. You know, it'll tell you what kind of rights you have as a creator of a translator, and you might be surprised. I think there was a tendency generally, at least, you know, in the prior to the last decade, of viewing translation as being, you know, just not a creative work. Like it was just something rote that people did from one language to another, which was clearly, I mean, a very wrong opinion, but it seemed to have pervaded, you know, most of the publishing industry. So, and I think a lot of translators probably didn't even realize that when you create a translation, you have the same measure of rights as the author of an original work. You have copyright ownership of that. You have the ability to license the work in different forms. You know, you have the ability to negotiate whether you want to, for instance, retain the derivative rights to use the work of translation in a TV or film medium. Retain audio rights. So all of those things are entirely possible. And, you know, every contract is a negotiation. And we'll get to that a little bit more. I mean, the whole point of this talk is to sort of empower translators to, one, understand and recognize what rights they have, and then have the ability to be able to negotiate. So you get a contract that is fair to you. So the first step, I think what was important for me in this whole process was just unraveling the misconceptions that had been around translation. You know, I'm sort of a translator myself. I've been around translators, so you know, not to get too esoteric, but the creative work is really unique. I mean, it is highly creative work. It's essentially the same work as authorship. You're making decisions. You're making you know, you're corresponding. You're trying to sort of recreate the texture of a word from one language into another. So there's no question that it's not a highly creative endeavor. So that was kind of the one of the prominent points of this contract, is that it hopefully allows translators to see what rights they have as creators, and then it goes through the different provisions and clauses of a standard contract, and talks about how you know, in the context of those rights, what you can negotiate, because what you can negotiate with the publisher, and we will get into the nitty-gritty of what each of those provisions of the model contract and just any translation book contract contains. But I think that's the general kind of gist of it. I think we can move into the individual provisions and start talking about the landscape a little bit more, right? Okay. So I think the best way to do it would be if we have shared a link of the translator model contract. So we'll just quickly kind of go over what each of the clauses there, what it does, and then, you know, as we are doing it, we can talk a little bit about what you might see as a translator, how you can change it. So the first one, and probably the most important clause, is the grant of rights clause, which is where you let the publisher do something with this work that you have created. Generally, you want to keep this clause as narrow as possible, because copyright is not just one thing, it's a bundle of several rights, and it really comes down to how you tailor the language of that grant to you know, to allow yourself to retain enough rights so you can do other things with it, and also to you know, only give rights up that are reasonably necessary for the particular publisher that you're working with to produce the book. You know, I mean, if you're working with a publisher that only produces paperback paperback books, no audio, no hardcover, it doesn't, you know, you can negotiate with them and retain the audio rights, the film rights, etc. That's the kind of basic idea behind the grants of rights clause. So the model contract, actually, what it sort of lays out is a reasonably narrow clause that gives the publisher the right to print, publish, and sell the translation in the English language. And then there is a placeholder for the formats. So hardcover and paperback formats, which are pretty common in a publishing transaction, verbatim text electronic book format, and audiobook format. A lot of publishers are now actually going into audio because of the astronomical success of the ACX platform, the Audible platform. And then the final element in a grant of rights clause is the territory. So you can restrict a publisher from using those rights or publishing the book in one country but not another. It's often a big point of negotiation in a traditional publishing contract, or in a trade book contract, because you want to keep foreign rights and you want to be able to go to say a French publisher and produce a French edition. In translation, what you want to be most careful about are English language territories. So ideally, if your publisher is based in the US, you would only grant US and possibly rights to Canada, and you would retain UK rights, because oftentimes if a translation comes out in the US and is successful, there is interest across the pond, and you might be able to negotiate directly with a UK publisher. Now, It might not always be possible. Oftentimes, in fact, many publishers insist on getting UK rights because they know that there is this sub-licensing opportunity across the pond. And in that case, you want to make sure that there is a provision in your contract that allows you to get something. So in every instance, it's like the choice is, do you retain the rights? If you cannot retain the rights, what should you get compensated for them? I'll just quickly stop here and see if Alex and Julia have anything to add here on grants of rights or.
No, and later I'll talk a little bit about how you can negotiate these different, how all of these different elements can serve in negotiating a contract.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think once we do the overview and go back to our panelists, we can talk about how they have negotiated and some tips for that. The second clause in our model contract is the delivery clause, and it seems like a pretty kind of anodyne clause, but it has some fairly important ramifications for you as a translator. It's a clause that you're agreeing to submit the translation to the publisher by a certain date, but the translation often often has to be in an acceptable form, and there is a range of things that you might see as a translator in those contracts. Sometimes it might say you might get a contract that says acceptable to the publisher in content and form in their sole discretion, and that's it. So what that means is that it's kind of up to the publisher. Like they can come back and say, actually, we just don't like it, and then you've done all the work, and then you can say, actually, we don't like it, and so we're not going to go ahead with publication. And by the way, we want the money back. That's kind of an extreme example, but it does the looser that language is around acceptability, or sometimes the word used is satisfactory. The looser that language is, the more vulnerable you are to the publisher changing their mind later in the process without you having any kind of cushion. So what's ideal for you as a translator is to say, I will submit something that is editorially acceptable, which essentially means that there is a the publisher can't wantonly sort of say, it's just really bad. Like they have to kind of say it's so bad that we cannot like proceed to editing and publishing it. So there's a measure of objectivity that's added into their evaluation of your work. You can, if you have submitted a sample translation, what you can do is because by that point the publisher has already evaluated the quality of your translation, so you can add a clause that says, if the translator has provided a sample translation prior to the agreement, the phrase editorially acceptable will be defined as the standard of the sample translation submitted prior to the contract, which again gives a measure of objectivity. You can also ask the publisher, actually require them to give you written comments if they don't find the translation acceptable. And this is usually a very good idea, because in that way the publisher has to justify their decision and give you a chance to revise according to their stated criteria within 30 days. So that is a very good thing to have in your contract, that grace period and a requirement that the publisher, gives you a chance to revise. Moving on, the third clause in our model contract is the editing clause. It's I'll eventually, when we get to it, I'll have the expert translators speak more to it, because it is a very sensitive topic of editing, because translation can be somewhat like subjective, and to what extent do you allow the publisher to completely change your meaning and decisions about rendering the original in a certain way. And so what's ideal there is for you to say that no material changes to the translation will be made without your approval. And a lot of, I've actually seen in my contract reviews, I've seen a fair number of, which I sort of like generally qualify in my mind. I haven't really created a list or anything, as like gold star translation publishers will actually allow the translator to do that. I mean, because they recognize that this is something, you know, you wouldn't ask an author, you know, we're going to rewrite your book, you know, and you can't say anything about it. So I think some publishers are beginning to realize that, and I think that's an important thing to sort of, if you can, ask for in your contract. Generally, the editing clause otherwise contains some basically it allows the publisher to copy edit your work, and then sets a timeline for sending you proof of the book. And there's usually this other clause where if you do not make changes before it goes to final proofing, then you have to pay us for changes later on in the process. So and some publishers make that requirement very low. Like if you have changes, you know, or just over like 5% of the entire text, then they ask you to pay for the late stage copy editing. So it's generally good to keep that to about 15%, because you know, you will have substantial changes in you know, late stage copy editing process. So the next section is fees and royalties, which not very important, so I think we can skip over that. I'm just kidding. So this is a very important one, and it's also a very tricky part of the contract when it comes to translation contracts, because there is a great variety in terms. And Alex and Julia, please feel free to interrupt anytime, because I know you guys are the experts in this area, as I kind of like describe the different configurations, you know, of payment provisions in a translation contract. A lot of times contracts have the payment there in a translation contract is what's called a translator fee. That's, you know, generally could be calculated on per word basis. So and I think it's usually in the target language. So if you translate a book and the translation turns out to be 80,000 words, your contract will say the publisher will pay you 13 cents or 15 cents, something like that. Or, you know, sometimes it says some, you know, an amount per 1,000 words. And the translator fee is similar to a book advance, where a publisher gives the author or a translator, you know, a lump sum to start the process of working on the book. But unlike a book advance, the translator fee is generally non-recoupable, unless like there's, you know, you do something awful as a translator and you know, you violate the contract in some way. What we see if publishers offer a translator fee, well, so let's start there, and then I'll mention that the fee is one part of a translator's compensation. The second part, and the more controversial part, or, you know, historically more controversial part, has been the royalties. You know, fortunately, we're actually seeing a great many publishers now have royalty clauses in their translation contracts, which is certainly a huge improvement. The royalty is an amount that a translator gets from each sale of the translation, or a share of the income for any kind of sub licenses, like if a US publisher licenses a UK edition of the work. And what we see that's kind of a reasonable royalty rate is around 2% of the list price, which is the price that's printed on the book, for for physical editions, 5% of the publisher's net receipts. And I'll explain what those means for what that means for electronic editions, and then 25% for subsidiary rights, like if a publisher licenses an ebook edition to another publisher, you get 25% of what comes to your publisher from that license. The two terms that I mentioned here, list price and net receipts. List price is the suggested retail price that's on every book. Most books will not get sold at that price. However, the way the publishing distribution chain works is that your publisher gives every bookstore a discount as an incentive to keep the book and sell the book. Amazon, for instance, customarily asks for a 50% discount from publishers. So and then they sell the book at not at a discounted price from the list price. But if you're getting paid on the list price, then it doesn't matter what the bookseller is selling your book for, what your publisher has sold the book for to the bookseller. You are getting on that number that's printed on the book jacket. It's not possible to calculate individual royalty amounts in every case, especially when the sales are not discrete and per unit like in a physical edition. So for electronic editions, the payments are typically made on net receipts, which is the amount the publisher gets, say, from the Kindle store, per month in terms of like ebook licenses sold. It's a lump sum amount, and you get a percentage of that. So if a publisher gets $500 after deducting, because every ebook platform has their platform fees. I think I forget, like I think Apple and Amazon, they all have around 15% fees or something like that, and then taxes. So after deducting those from the aggregate sales is what the publisher gets as net receipts, and you get, hopefully you can negotiate 5% of those. So that's and similar for sub-licenses, because the publisher is usually seeing a lump sum amount over a month and not like a broken down amount. So that's kind of the general landscape on fees and royalties. We'll revisit it quick. I'll make this make the rest go fast so we can talk a little bit more. Section 5 publication is generally you want to have oh, sorry, Alex.
Yeah, I was wondering maybe Julia could say a few words here about negotiating fees and royalties. I know we're going to do it in full, but this might be a good place.
I want to talk about this a bit later in a more structured way, but I think one thing to keep in mind when you're negotiating royalties is, which I think is an argument that hopefully the publisher will understand, is that by giving the translator a share in the success of the book they have translated, you actually ensure their willingness to participate in the promotion of the book. Because otherwise, if the translator isn't seeing royalties, there is no financial incentive to actually do any of the work that goes outside the simple not simple, but the matter-of-fact translation of the book itself. And psychologically, I think that does change a lot. I am much more unwilling to do any promotional work for a book I've translated if I'm not expecting a share of the sales of that book. I mean, maybe there are people out there who are more generous than I am, but I think of myself as a worker first and foremost. And with something that's so bound to the arts, we can sometimes lose sight of that important fact.
That's such an excellent point, Julia. And another thing, I guess, like a more cynical reason for why you might want a royalty provision is that what if the book you translated is a runaway success? I mean, it can happen. And if your contract says, all you get out of this contract is the translator fee of, $10,000 or $8,000, and your book is everywhere, and movies are being made in the English language, then you are really, really cutting yourself off from that. It just makes sense for the translator to have, just like an author has a stake in the book's success, for the translator to have that. And so quickly moving on, you want to make sure also in Section 5 of our model contracts, the publication clause, you want to specify a time during which the publisher must publish or revert rights back to you. 12 months from the acceptance of your translation is a reasonable ask for that. Section 6, permissions. Permissions are, so if you're, say, if you're translating a book that has quotes from other authors, oftentimes, you need permission to use anyone else's work anytime you're doing something. Publishers, if it comes to comes to you having to get a lot of permissions for work that is embedded into the work you're translating, it's reasonable for your publisher to kind of bear that cost and work it out with the foreign publisher. Warranties and indemnities sounds very scary language, but they're mostly promises you're making to the publisher. Some promises, are reasonable, like, you promising that, you haven't plagiarized the translation, but then there are other promises that are just completely unreasonable in a translation contract, but are annoyingly common, where the publisher will ask a translator to promise that they have secured permission for all of the underlying works, that the translation doesn't violate, defame anybody. I know defamation is a big sort of issue right now, and it doesn't violate anyone's rights of publicity and privacy. As a translator, you don't have any, you shouldn't be asked to promise that this work is not defamatory. You're just translating it. You don't know whether the author has said something defamatory. So what's ideal there is you revise that clause to say that you're essentially only responsible for the work that you have created, which is the translation, and anything that's existing in the original work, you're not responsible for that. So if the author has defamed somebody, that's not on you, and you will not be on the hook for any of that. And our model contract suggests language to do that. So moving on, accounting and statements, pretty, especially if you're getting royalties, it's important to get them, have them itemized so you know exactly what the book is earning. And it's also important for terminating the contract. We'll talk about it in a little bit. Section 9 of the model contract is audit rights. It just gives you a right to, if you suspect something odd going on with your royalty statements, it gives you a right to audit the publisher's records. Clause 10 is copyright. Typically, publishers register copyright on behalf, good publishers register copyright on behalf of their authors. It's easy for them. They're going to the copyright office all the time. They say, okay, we'll register this for you at $55 or something. We'll pay for that. So, it's nice if you can get that clause in your contract. Oftentimes that clause will exist where the publisher undertakes the obligation to register copyright. You want to make sure that they do it within 3 months of publication, because that is the cutoff for when you can get, whether or not you can get statutory damages and attorney's fees if someone infringes your work. So, and the contract describes it a little bit more. Model contract, clause 11, credit is a huge, it's a huge topic right now, and we think it's fair for translators to be identified on the front cover and the title page, alongside the author. I mean, after all, you're the reason why book exists in the English language, and I know there are campaigns going on to make that a universal practice. clause 12, translator copies. You should get some free copies and be able to buy additional copies at a discount. Okay, clause 13, probably the most important clause, the last most important clause, termination. So refer back to the clause 1, grant of rights. We talked about it a little bit. The grant of rights clause usually has a duration. When you're giving the publisher rights to do something, you're giving the publisher the right to do that for you know, a finite amount of time, except that typically this finite amount of time is extremely long. It's the duration of copyright. And the duration of copyright, for people that don't know, is 70 years after the death of the author / translator / creator. So if you are giving the publisher, you know, the rights to do something with your translation for the duration of copyright, without there being any other mechanism in the contract for you to get those rights back, then you can't do anything with your work for until 70 years after you're dead, basically. So which you can't, you know, or your heirs can't do anything. So that's why a termination clause is extremely important. Section 13 of the model contract provides a few different options to be reasonably sure that you will get the rights back once the publisher is done printing the book. You know, you'd be surprised how many publishers just forget that they have rights to something. It's very common. It's an industry with a very short memory. So you want to make sure that one of the options is that the publisher reverts rights to you automatically if their license from the author, because remember, the author has to first give the publisher rights to translate and publish the book. If their license from the author ends, we have a second option where you can set a royalty threshold. You know, you can say, if I'm not getting a certain amount, $250 in a year from this book, I can ask you to revert rights. And you know, if the publisher doesn't pay you statements or stops paying you, then the contract would end automatically. So that's kind of the general you know, termination clause landscape. If you look at the model contract, we have language and a substantial commentary on that. And the last two clauses are clause 14 amendment, that says that, you know, you both have to agree to any changes to the agreement. And finally, jurisdiction is just oftentimes the publisher, it's where the publisher is located. That's where any disputes around the contract would be decided, litigated, or arbitrated. So I think I want to stop here because I know that I breezed through a lot of stuff, but we also want to have enough time to talk about negotiations. And we can always do a second webinar if, you know, if this is too fast.
Thank you, Umer. I guess if we've learned anything, it's that our model contract contains a ton of information and it's not possible to summarize it in 30 minutes. I'm going to try to go very quickly through some things that you should take into consideration when negotiating a contract with a publisher, and also before the contract when negotiating terms with the publisher. As I said before, this is just to reiterate that translators are workers. And even though literary translation is framed as a labor of love, it is first and foremost labor for which you are entitled to be paid fairly. When you enter a negotiation with a publisher, you're both defending your best interests. So, which is why it can be a little bit fraught, sorry. But hopefully if things go well, everyone will still be friends at the end of the day. The first thing I think about, apart from, you know, what the book I'm translating is who my client is. We're all trying to make a living. So things I keep in mind are the size of the press. If it's a small press, I might be more lenient. Where they're based, if they're based somewhere with a currency that struggles to stand up to the dollar, then I might also be more lenient. And also your history with them, because if you've been working for the same press for a while, much like an employee at a company, you can start to request better terms. At this point, they know the quality of your work. You're not new and unexpected and full of surprises. You're, you know, a stable, solid worker. So now that you have all of that in mind, it's important to identify what's important to you in terms of your rights. Umer touched on many different points, and here are a couple that occurred to me. There's the deadline, the fee, the royalties, the share of subsidiary rights, having your name on the cover, how many copies of the book you want, approval of edits and copyright, among many others. My priorities tend to be in this order: fee, royalties, subrights, copyright, approval of edits, name on cover, and long deadline. And I'm probably forgetting a few others, but I guess for me, it's most important to be able to actually sustain myself as a literary translator. Much like publishers are trying to make sure that their business is sustainable, you are your own business, so you have to make sure that your own business is sustainable. So as we talked about before, the contract is a bundle of rights. They are dependent on the authors, the rights in the underlying contract, in that if the author doesn't give you the right to, doesn't give an audio publisher the right to create an audiobook in English of their work, you can't grant them, the publisher, the right to create an English language audiobook of that work, because those two are bound together. And it's the same for the author. They can't, if you hold audio rights in your translation, the author can't license English language rights to an audio publisher, unless they commission a wholly other translation, which would be very complicated. Anyway, I digress. So say that you receive an offer where the fee is actually in advance, which means you have to earn out against the advance before you see royalties. The usefulness of having certain royalties beyond list price is that you can actually calculate more or less how many copies it will take you to earn out your advance. So say if the book costs $25 and you've been offered a 1.5% list royalties, it'll take around 22,000 copies sold for you to start seeing royalties, which is a lot of copies, especially in the world of literary translation, or so we're told. Translations don't sell, they say. So if you see something like that, and you've been trying to push for a royalty from first sale and they're not budging, you could try to lower the sales threshold so that you're not earning out against the full advance, but earning out against half of it, for example. Or you could ask for more copies so that you can sling them on the street and make black market book money. I'm joking. You do that in contracts, but there's just a bit of wiggle room in terms of how you ask for one thing and sacrifice another. There's also a lot of authors see bonus structures in their own contracts. So if the book sells 5,000 copies in the first year, you can ask for a bonus. This is much more rare in translation contracts, I think, than in author contracts, but it would be a useful way to start compensating. If they don't want to put your name on the cover, ask for it on the spine or the back cover, or ask for something else again, like a longer deadline. All of these are just negotiating pieces. So think of it a bit as when you're, trying to decide with your partner who's going to do the dishes and who's going to, I don't know, sweep the living room or whatever. You give some and then you take some, and it changes with each contract you have. I did mention the thing about small press versus big press, because some presses genuinely can't pay you more, and some presses pretend that they can't pay you more, and it's worth knowing which one you're negotiating with. also a lot of smaller presses depend on grant funding to be able to publish translations. And so another thing that you can do if, for example, the publisher offers you something that you consider to be a low fee, is to say, well, if you get a grant, if you are given a grant for this translation, then my fee will go up to 120 pounds per 1,000 words or whatever. Or, I mean, I think we're trying to move away from per word rates when possible, even though I'm a bit stuck in calculating it that way for my own projects. But oftentimes what people will do is they'll calculate the word rate, the per word rate for the whole book, and then just round up. You could round down, but you shouldn't round down. You're not getting paid enough money as is. So yeah, just we're tailoring the contract to our needs. We're all human individuals who have different needs. One thing I want to also point out is that when you undersell yourself, you undersell your colleagues. No pressure, but we are a community of workers. So if there's always someone who, for whatever reason, is able to take a much lower rate than most of their colleagues because they have a partner who makes a decent amount of money, who, because they have inherited wealth for whatever reason, a day job, then that affects the ecosystem of translation workers. I think that's all. Again, we're workers. Don't forget that. I've tried to answer some of the questions that were coming up, and I did see a few people ask what you can do when the press won't budge and refuses to negotiate. And I think the truth is that if the author is bent on selling the book to this press, author, agent, or publisher are bent on selling the book to this press, and they refuse to negotiate with you, then you walk away. If the terms aren't acceptable, either you make your own work life fit those terms, take on more work later hours, work weekends, do what you have to do because you really want to translate this book, or you walk away and convince yourself you've dodged a bullet. Because if someone is unwilling to be flexible and adapt their contract to a changing landscape, then you probably don't want to work with them. Or maybe you do, I don't know. That's my hard line sometimes, but it depends on the book. Depends on how much work you have lined up. Only you will know what's best for your own work life. But anyway, I think that's all. And we have lots of questions to answer, and also questions that were sent in advance. So Alex, I think that's over to you.
Thank you, Julia. You covered what I think are really the fundamental points for people to keep in mind when they're negotiating. I have up here in front of me a list of some of the questions that came in. Is it okay for me to answer a couple of those?
Sure.
One thing that I want to uplift that Julia said or reiterate is it's impossible to negotiate if you don't know what your bottom line is. The only way, this can be a hard truth to swallow, but the only way to be able to negotiate is if you're willing to say no. If you're not willing to say no to anything, then you're not actually negotiating. So it's important to ask for, when it comes to money in particular, to ask for more than you want, and be prepared to, because unless you've already agreed in advance, and sometimes that does happen, the odds are that the publisher will offer you less than you want. So it is possible to, negotiate if you're starting from a higher position. If you start from your bottom, then you're stuck and you're either going to go down or just walk away. So that's really important. And usually, you know, there are different parts of a contract. I mean, I think it's important, like on the one hand, to kind of dehumanize this and say, if a publisher says they have a budget, and say, well, you know, I have a budget too. I mean, you know, I have a household. Um, I'm not a company, but I have a budget too, and to that can maybe help to depersonalize it a little. But on the other hand, also to personalize it, because the thing about translation contracts, I know that it depends, you know, of course, on the size of the press, but many of us are negotiating not with a lawyer or a legal department, but directly with the people who are going to be editing our books. And remember that they actually, at this point, by the time that we're negotiating a contract with them, are probably pretty committed to the book and to us. And they want to get this contract signed with us. And you know, I think that a little bit of, you know, pushing on one area, say on getting a higher royalty or even a higher fee, but being willing to maybe, you know, settle for fewer translator copies, it may sound, you may be skeptical that that can work, but I think that a lot of it is the spirit that you have going back and forth, the feeling, and even if it's by email and not over the phone. And I will also say, and I know this from other translators, I have not yet been in this situation about negotiating a book itself, but about negotiating an introduction, is talking to somebody can sometimes cut through the tension that arises through emailing. And so if you have a chance to pick up the phone and talk to the person that you're negotiating with directly, that can also be a good, you know, tactic for being able to get what you want. And, you know, Julia covered dealing with small presses versus large presses. Yeah, there was a couple of people have asked about negotiating contracts with authors or other end users besides publishers. So I did want to mention that. And there are some of us out there who do this on a regular basis. And so I'm going to say that I hope, Umair, maybe this is something that the Guild can work on, is to have a sort of a model agreement with authors as well. I do think that will be useful. You know, the main thing to keep in mind is that the author is not necessarily in a position to publish. So there, you know, what you're going to be talking about mainly is your pay. And you know, the question is what is enforceable? Often, you know, also the author is going to be living in a different country than you. So legally, it may be tough to enforce some of those things, but you can certainly ask the author to commit to, for instance, sharing the royalties and letting you know what terms the author gets, because knowing what terms the author gets is a big part of knowing what things that you need or can negotiate for, especially when it comes to subsidiary rights. I'm going to pause. Oh, yes. So the one other question which has come up, which I think is really important to discuss. One of the questions that came in was if the author speaks that language, I assume meaning the language that we're translating into, can they challenge a word or line in the translation? So this does not come up, I would say, often, but it does come up maybe regularly. That's why it's important for your contract to spell out what rights of approval that you have. It can be tricky because, of course, if the publisher has a delicate relationship with the author, they may not necessarily feel like, you know, a press may feel overly deferential to an author too. So I think, you know, I don't know, maybe Umair, you can speak to if the Authors Guild has ever actually been called into a dispute between a translator and a press about intervention by the author into the translator's work. Has that ever happened? In terms of a contractual obligation the press has to not make changes without the translator's consent.
I haven't encountered a dispute quite like that where an author, for instance, intervened at the last minute or like at any point and said, you know, I don't like it or I'm not going to approve it. But it's entirely, I mean, it seems entirely possible that it happens quite often, and it will largely depend on, you know,
the publisher, your publisher, and what they have signed with the author. And if, you know, it could be, and sometimes, you know, they might have told the author, yeah, actually, you know, we won't publish anything without your approval. But in your contract, it doesn't say anything, you know, and, you know, so they may, in that case, they may be in a kind of paradox, and they might be breaching contracts on both sides. So, but yeah, I mean, it's a case by case situation, and it would really come down to like what you have signed in your contract in terms of your rights. That's mostly what you have to be concerned with, because that's your leverage against the publisher. I do want to, Alex, are there any other questions? Because there's a couple from the live Q&A that I wanted to touch on before we, so one question is, and it's an important one, and because I was breezing through the rest of the contract, I didn't touch on this, but I'll read the question. Aren't the derivative rights in the translation subject to the derivative rights in the work being translated, and therefore seriously constrained? And does the existence of a translation restrict the ability of the owner of the underlying work from doing another translation? It's part of that question is actually very tricky, and there's not a clear legal answer, but yes. So generally speaking, a translation is a derivative work of the original. And as part of the bundle of rights under copyright, every author and every creator has the right to create derivative works or give someone the authority to create derivative works. So when you're translating, that's the right there's already a permission in place. You know, your publisher probably has the permission from the author to create a translation. Or, you know, we touched on another element of translations where you're dealing directly with the author and the author gives you permission. So you are creating a derivative work, but when that derivative work comes into existence, it has the full scope of rights under copyright, including the further right to create derivative works based on the translation. And however, because the analogy that I use for translations is like, it's like a Siamese twin of the original. I don't know how successful it is. Maybe someday Julia and Alex can tell me if this analogy that I've been using actually makes sense. But, you know, you have like two separate consciousnesses, but they're kind of conjoined in some ways. So in order to make a film, an English language film based on a French novel that you've translated, you would, the producer would also need to get rights from the original author or the publisher, because the ultimate product has creative elements from the original, which you have rendered into English, but like the characters, for instance, the settings, like all of that is copyrighted expression that is, you know, controlled by the author. So yes, there are some serious constraints to, you know, how you can exploit your rights as a translator in the translation. The other quick thing that I wanted to mention, Paula Gordon raised a good point when we were talking about terms. We do commonly see the term for the duration of copyright, but it is entirely possible, and in many cases, that you might see the term being a term of 10 years or 5 years. Oftentimes when this happens, the term will match the term of the permission from the author. Like the author has only given the publisher permission to publish a translation for 10 years versus like for the duration of copyright. So you will see that, and then it's possible to even, you know, limit the term to 10, just to a certain discrete year number, but it won't be possible if the publisher has rights in perpetuity for the duration of copyright from the author.
As far as I'm aware, in Spain, translations are on limited terms, just like the underlying rights, so that the publisher has to renew those rights every 5 or 10 years, for example. And so the translator gets an extra payment every 10 years to renew those rights. We're not there in the US though.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else that we need to, because we are out of time. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I do see some questions that are from the perspective of authors in terms of finding translators and finding agents who handle foreign rights. And yeah, so we that's not the scope of the conversation today. But if you have those questions, you can send us an email or send in a legal request, and the legal department can help you with that. Generally, there are, I mean, the translation agencies may exist in certain countries. Like I know in Sweden, there are some agencies, in Italy, there are some agencies who handle translation, but in the US, it's typically a regular literary agent that handles foreign rights and translation rights. Johnny,
I'm wondering if we can collect the questions from the Q&A to answer them in a blog post afterwards. There are a lot of them. Some of them are more complex and you can just quickly type an answer to in a live Q&A box. Is that something we can do?
Exactly, that's what I was thinking. So feel free, if you have any additional questions, you can email support@authorsguild.org. I will get those, we'll collect those, and we can create future content to answer more questions. But obviously a lot was covered here today. Thank you all so much.
all right. Take care, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.